We start with the explosions that continue to rock Gaza. Dozens more killed in fighting between Israel and Hamas. Israeli warplanes continue to unleash heavy airstrikes on Gaza early Monday, a day after 42 Palestinians were killed, the deadliest attack yet in almost a week of fighting. Our correspondent Noor Harazin has the latest from Gaza.
Well, since the beginning of this escalation on the Gaza Strip, and Israel has been saying that they are targeting Hamas homes and Palestinian militants. However, what we are witnessing is a big number of casualties, children and women being killed and arriving to the hospitals. Tonight was one of the most terrifying nights on the people of Gaza. It gets from bad to worse whenever this escalation is still going on. More than 150 airstrikes were launched on the Gaza Strip. Many of these airstrikes targeted this street that where I am standing. It is called Al-Wahda Street, and again it is one of the most densely populated streets in central Gaza city. There is many shops, there is hospitals, residential homes. The Israeli air raids targeted the roads itself, destroying the infrastructure. Many homes were targeted in this street, as you can see behind me, and there was tens of people inside it. The civil defense forces, the Palestinian civil defense forces, are still, until now and after around 15 hours from the attack, still trying to find survivors under the rubble. According to the Palestinian medical sources, 42 people were killed only in this attack, including 18 women and 10 children. This brings up the death toll here in Gaza over the past 7 days up to 159 people killed, including 60 children, while more than 1,300 were reported injured. On the other hand, Egypt opened its border with Rafah today, allowing hundreds of Palestinians to leave the Gaza Strip. There is also unconfirmed news that in the upcoming days, Egypt will allow medical aid and humanitarian donations to enter the Gaza Strip.
And earlier, China's Central Television spoke with Hamas's spokesperson Abdul Latif, who said a ceasefire can only happen once Israel stops its aggression against Palestinians.
Israel initiated the conflict and aggression, which started in several places, including residential areas in Sheikh Jarrah, the square in Jerusalem's Old City, the Gaza Strip, and West Bank. The ceasefire can only happen if Israel stops all kinds of attacks and aggression towards Palestinian people. Then will Hamas consider talks with Israel and offer options. Hamas is fighting back to protect the Palestinian people. Will not let the Palestinian people suffer these violations on their own.
Meanwhile, Israel's prime minister defended his response, saying the country will not ease up with its military campaign. Stephanie Fried has more on that from southern Israel.
No Gaza-Israel ceasefire. That's the latest update from Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, delivered in a live address alongside Israel's defense minister and chief of staff following a security cabinet session and consultations with top defense chiefs on Sunday. It will take more time, Netanyahu said. Gaza rocket fire and Israel military strikes continued on Sunday, day 7 of the violent exchange between the sides that has claimed the lives of more than 130 victims, including dozens of children, mostly in Gaza. According to Netanyahu, Israel has carried out 1,500 strikes on Gaza targets since the start of the operation. Israel's aim, he said in his address, is to maximize efficiency and minimize casualties. Despite international pressure to reach a ceasefire deal, Netanyahu praised U.S. and international backing for what he said is Israel's right to defend itself against rocket attacks. Defense Minister Benny Gantz and Chief of Staff Aviv Kohavi also addressed the nation, saying Israel has a moral obligation to hit Hamas and there are, quote, more stages ahead. News of continued strikes comes amidst speculation the two sides are deliberating ceasefire terms via mediators behind the scenes. Stephanie Fried, CGTN, in southern Israel.
Women and children are among the mounting death toll in a week of fighting between Gaza and Israel. The latest include 2 women and 8 children in a blast at a residential area on Sunday.
They destroyed the house without warning at 1:30 in the morning, says Mohammed. People were sleeping. The children were sleeping.
We were safe in the house, and the children were safe. Why did this all happen? Is this a result of American law or Israeli law?
Did this innocent child fire any missiles? The child is innocent.
Fear on both sides along the Gaza-Israel border. A number of Israeli households feature safe rooms, and many residents have fled to northern Israel because of the recent rise in attacks.
When we hear the sirens, we have 15 seconds to come and get inside. The 6 last days, we've been in 60 times, maybe more, coming here, and we sleep here in the shelter.
Many people in this area believe that the solution is not by force. The solution must be a peaceful solution. And the situation in Gaza is terrible. Humanitarian, it's terrible. They have no water, they have hardly any electricity. It's terrible there. And until this will be solved somehow, there's no chance.
As the Israeli-Palestinian conflict escalates.
Meanwhile, the United Nations Security Council is calling for a ceasefire. It held its first public meeting since the recent escalation in violence. At least 188 people have died in Gaza, at least 10 in Israel. William Dinslow reports from the UN headquarters in New York.
As the Israeli-Palestinian conflict escalates, the international community is working to strike a peaceful resolution.
The current hostilities are utterly appalling. This latest round of violence only perpetuates the cycles of death, destruction and despair, and pushes farther to the horizon any hopes of coexistence and peace.
The United Nations has met 3 times in the past week to discuss the ongoing violence seen in Israel and Gaza. But Sunday's meeting was the first not to be held behind closed doors. The meeting was chaired by China. Foreign Minister Wang Jin says a ceasefire should be a priority.
The Security Council, shouldering the primary responsibility for safeguarding international peace and security, must take strong actions on the Palestine-Israel conflict, reiterate its firm support for the two-state solution, and do more to cool down the situation as soon as possible.
As Israel and Palestinian casualties grow, the two sides showed no signs of backing down during the Security Council meeting.
We will take all steps necessary to defend our people. Now, the choice is yours. The world is watching.
The international consensus you have all helped shape and defend is being destroyed in front of our very eyes. The alternative that Israel chose is apartheid.
The meeting concluded with the Security Council again unable to issue a unified press statement, reportedly due to reluctance from the US as it carries out its own behind-the-scenes efforts to end the violence. After the meeting, China, Tunisia and Norway issued a statement calling on all sides to cease hostilities. China holds the rotating Security Council presidency this month and vows to keep pushing the Council to take action and speak with a unified voice. William Dinslow, CGTN, New York.
More Muslim countries are condemning the violence, demanding Israel stop the attacks. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation held an emergency meeting with its 57 nations, calling Israel's actions a violation of international law. CGTN's Adel Al-Marouki reports.
After the Arab League strongly criticized Israel during an emergency meeting last week, Saudi Arabia rallied more international support on Sunday. As the current chair of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Riyadh called for an emergency foreign ministers meeting to discuss the latest Israeli attacks on Palestinians.
Saudi Arabia is calling on the international community to urgently move to help stop the military operations and to work towards bringing to life peaceful negotiations aimed at a two-state solution based on international standards and the Arab Peace Initiative. The kingdom also supports all ceasefire efforts, including efforts by our brotherly countries, Egypt and Jordan.
The 4 hours virtual meeting ended with unanimous agreement to strongly condemn Israel's latest military escalations against Palestinians in Gaza and Jerusalem. They accuse Israel of deteriorating stability and security in the region and asked it to refrain from tampering with Al-Aqsa Mosque. OIC called upon the international community to intervene in order to save innocent lives. Meanwhile, Palestinian Foreign Minister Riyad al-Maliki accused Arab states which recently normalized ties with Israel for fueling the current crisis. And at least 10,000 citizens have been displaced and hundreds of homes destroyed. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
And protests against Israel continue in cities all over the world. People in Pakistan burned Israeli and American flags on Sunday as they marched through the streets of Karachi. Protesters and security forces clashed along the border between Lebanon and Israel. And police broke up crowds in Jordan's capital, Amman. Authorities there had allowed peaceful protests, but only for a few hours. Massive demonstrations were also held in Cyprus on Sunday. There, police used pepper spray on demonstrators outside the Israeli embassy. Well, for more on this, let's bring in Wang Jin in Xi'an. He's an associate professor at China's Northwest University, specializing in Middle Eastern studies. Professor, it's good to have you with us on the show. So the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, said Sunday his country will continue operations for as long as necessary to restore calm and order. Hopes are fading, but from your perspective, how likely is a ceasefire at this point?
I think that Israel will take some measures to prevent and to heavily destroy the Hamas capability before they really stop their military operations. Because from the perspective of Israel, they are under the threat from Hamas rockets firing. And if we see what is happening during the past weeks, that the Hamas rockets from Gaza actually threatens the Israeli society and also shocked the Israeli public. So that is why I think Israeli government, especially Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, hopes to take some measures to show that his government and the Israeli society will not surrender and will do everything they can to prevent this danger. But what I want to stress here is that any unilateral actions in the Israel and Palestinian issues cannot actually solve the problem, cannot downplay the violence role, because actually what we are witnessing during the past 2 decades or several decades is that the violence actually only leads to more violence, and the only we find out is needed is to find ways to talk, find ways to negotiation, and on the negotiation table that could solve everything. But although we have a lot of difficulties, we have a lot of problems, but dialogue is the only way out.
And yet it's been very difficult to get these two sides to the negotiating table and to get them to agree on anything. Still, China's foreign minister during the UN Security Council meeting proposed that China could possibly host talks between Israelis and Palestinians. Other countries have tried and failed to serve as mediators. So how likely do you think it could be that Beijing could step into this?
I think whether or not it can succeed is one matter, but on the other hand, whether or not they have the real willingness to start it or have the courage to start it is another matter. Because what we're witnessing now is the escalation of hostilities and escalation of violence. That's for sure. Because everybody knows this is very difficult, and it is very hard at this time to organize such a conference because due to the very zero-sum hostilities between the two sides. But we're also witnessing that every second and every minute we wait, and every second and every minute we are wasting, means that more kids, more women, and more civilians were killed, and more people's life and the daily order was threatened by the violence. So that is why I think China hope to organize such a conference, even against a lot of difficulties, even a lot of uncertainties, whether or not this conference can really help pacify the tension. But I think it shows China's responsibility to the international society. That is, China hopes to be responsible for the international order, and China hopes to do something to help the civilians, both in Israel and in the Gaza of Palestine.
But Professor, in this process here of China trying to serve as mediator here, it's been proposing the two-state solution as a solution here, calling for an independent state of Palestine based on the 1967 borders. It's a call we hear from all over the world, but at this point, really, how viable is that idea?
the two-state solution is still the very fundamental principle that can solve the Israel and Palestinian conflict and the crisis, because this is the only way out. One-state solution is not acceptable, because we know that in the modern world that both the rights of Jews and also the Palestinians should be respected, should be assured. But here the problem is that how to implement it. There were a lot of ways to implement two-state solution. For example, the United States had the way that they recognize the Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. They hope to maintain the most parts of the Jewish settlements in the West Bank. That means the harm the interest and harm the living space of the Palestinians. So they just constructed the so-called two-state solution on the sufferings of the Palestinians. That is unacceptable. That cannot succeed because it actually cannot be accepted by the Palestinians. So China's two-state solution means that China hopes to base this idea or the political principle based on the consensus of the two groups, I mean the Palestinians and as well as the Jews, and try to find ways not only by China itself, but altogether with international society. So we know that it will be very hard, it's very difficult, but that's the things that we have to do, and that's the things that could be only succeeded through the very efforts from the whole international society, and as well as the efforts from the cooperation between Palestinians and Israelis. So this is the only way out, as I stress, and I think China showed its responsibility and its courage in against this backdrop. Jonathan.
Right. Professor Wang Jin from China's Northwest University, thanks for your time. And we have other news to get to here on Global Watch.